Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma Vigeland out today. Joining me now, Adam Johnson, co-host of the Citations Needed podcast and writer at the column newsletter on Substack. We'll put a link to both at majority.fm. Adam, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
You wrote a piece about a week or so ago about the 7 unions that had written to Joe Biden, asking, or I should say, demanding an end to Israeli military aid over what Israel has been doing in Gaza and perhaps more. And subsequent to that, there was a story that came out, I guess today or yesterday, that Shawn Fain was contemplating unendorsing Biden in part, maybe in part over this, but in part because he hadn't heard from him after the debate and was suspicious, has since spoken to Kamala Harris, and apparently a UAW endorsement is imminent. But tell us about that story. And then one I know that you have coming out in Real News today about Harris's, sort of divining what Harris's position is on this and what she may or may not do if she's elected.
Yeah. So the basic question, I think, facing a lot of people for whom Gaza, which is broadly considered to be a genocide on the so-called left, I think it's fair to say many genocide scholars tend to agree. So the G word, I think, is appropriate here. Obviously, the co-founder of Human Rights Watch, among other scholars, call it that. So it's obviously very urgent. It's the crime of crimes. It's the thing that you would think would be most important, or at least in top 5 most important things in terms of whether or not a candidate you support wants to continue arming, funding, and backing a genocide. So this is obviously of tremendous import to a lot of people, both progressive and even those on the center. And so the issue of to the extent to which Harris breaks from Biden is of urgent importance. And what I argue in my piece that's coming out today, and what I argued somewhat in these Times piece from last week, is that much of what Harris is doing is simply a more sophisticated version of what Biden is doing. That isn't to say that Harris can't change course meaningfully or come around to the idea of actually threatening or imposing, or at least making commitments to threaten or impose an arms embargo on Israel, as is the current demand of the unions that you laid out, the 7 unions representing 6 million workers, as well as Palestinian activists themselves. And the uncommitted movement. That's not to say that she can't come around to that, but it's important to clarify that thus far she has not at all. And so what do we have here? We have here what people have called a, quote, change in tone. But of course, change in tone in $3.95 can get you a cup of coffee at Starbucks. It doesn't really matter. And indeed, there isn't really a change of tone, because while Biden hasn't really even bothered running through the motions of empathy for Palestinians, he really is, to his credit, at least honestly cruel and honestly indifferent, and has, of course, openly denied the death counts, even though those are death counts his own State Department uses. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has trafficked in this kind of bleeding heart language that Harris is using. So as far as the administration as a whole goes, the what I call empathy speak is not new. And so what people are demanding, and this is, I think, the thing that confuses a lot of people here. There's been much confusion about the White House's position around the ceasefire, and it does get a little complicated. And I understand why people are confused. So I want to take some time, if you'll indulge me, to sort of explain why the White House's nominal support for a ceasefire is in fact total horseshit. Am I allowed to say that word?
Yeah.
So for the first few months of the Israeli leveling, destruction, displacement of Gaza, the State Department issued a memo effectively banning all government employees or those of the administration from using the word ceasefire in similar terms, de-escalation, et cetera. They were supporting Israel's nominal goal of, quote unquote, eliminating Hamas, and were going all in on that. Then as the Michigan primary began to creep up in February, and the other primaries and the uncommitted movement really started to pick up steam and generating bad headlines, the White House, somewhat sophisticatedly, and I think in retrospect, somewhat inevitably, began to adopt the term ceasefire, but really kind of pivoted what the broadly accepted definition was and had been since October. So ceasefire demands were made by groups as varied as Amnesty International, Oxfam, 18 different UN agencies, over 400 ex-Biden campaign and administration officials, over 100 Nobel laureates, had all demanded a ceasefire in Gaza, which has a very specific historical meaning. From 2014 to 2018 to 2021 to 2008, 2009, during Cass-led, a ceasefire demand is a call for Israel to stop bombing and, in certain cases, invading or withdrawing from Gaza under the implied or explicit threat of U.S. pulling its support of Israel, which is dispositive. Make no mistake, Israel cannot take a piss without asking permission from the United States. It's a relatively small, relatively poor country. And Israeli officials say that all the time, by the way. This is how it was broadly understood. This is not a controversial claim. The idea that the U.S. could use its dispositive leverage to compel Israel into stopping the current hostilities, not to sort of enter into a 100-year peace agreement where everyone lives, kumbaya, but to stop current hostilities, to lay the groundwork for what is ultimately a political problem in need of a political solution.
And let me just say, interject if I could, that we have evidence of this, both historical and evidence of this from, like you say, Gallant said it at one point. I mean, even in the first ceasefire, I think there was, or should I say, truce or whatever.
Temporary pause was the term they
temporary
used
pause
back then.
or whatever kinetic, disposition. There are quotes from Gallant and other top Israeli officials saying, like, the U.S. wanted this. We had to do it. What are we going to do? Right,
because they literally don't have the munitions to continue the level of bombing, and they don't have the weapons parts. It's the same thing with Saudi Arabia and Yemen. They really can't function without U.S. support. Everybody knows that. To the extent to which people act like the U.S. is not the decisive factor here. It's similar to, like, if you've ever argued with a toddler and you don't want to sort of explain why you can't give them a popsicle, you just say, we're actually out of popsicles. It's a way you sort of turn it into a process issue so you can avoid the sort of ideological battle. And that's clearly a liberal coping mechanism. And nobody believes this, by the way. Again, Brookings Institute, Israeli officials, the White House themselves says, Blinken has implied several times that the U.S. can stop it whenever they want, right? So that aside, so then the ceasefire began to be blended into a kind of vibe, into what we now call these kind of ceasefire negotiations. But of course, the idea of a ceasefire negotiation is a totally false market, because the U.S. can impose one whenever it wants. It doesn't need Israel to sign off on a ceasefire. It needs to impose one. That's one of the sort of perks of being an empire. One can do that whenever they want. So then they punted to this vague ceasefire negotiation, which was a negotiation to an extent, but it was a negotiation for hostage exchanges for a temporary pause. And Israeli officials, up to and including Netanyahu, have been extremely clear they do not support a lasting ceasefire. They do not support an end to hostilities, and that they reserve the right and maintain the goal of quote unquote total victory. That's what he told Congress last week, that they are going to quote unquote eliminate Hamas. They were going to kill everybody in Hamas who's a meaningful fighter or political or military leader. This is to the Israelis' credit. They've been crystal clear about this. To the extent to which there's been confusion, it's coming from the White House and liberal Zionist groups whose job is to kind of spin this as a good faith Israeli ceasefire, proposal, right? So then May 31st, Biden gives a speech. Well, let me back to the Michigan primary. So then on the eve of the Michigan primary, Biden says we're going to get a ceasefire. And the media is kind of surprised by this, because they're like, well, historically, they haven't really used that word. Is this a genuine ceasefire in terms of lasting, or is this just rebranding what they used to call a temporary pause into a ceasefire? That is ultimately what it was, which is they supported a temporary pause in fighting, what some people call a genocide smoke break, while they exchange hostages, Palestinians for Israelis. And then Israel, again, to their credit, openly said they're going to go back and quote unquote eliminate Hamas, which is because it's an unachievable objective. According to Tony Blinken, one NBC News report, Tony Blinken said, you cannot eliminate Hamas. It's not possible behind closed doors to Netanyahu. It is manifestly a genocidal objective, because it's pretextual. The goal is to keep displacing people in Gaza, punishing them in hopes that they immigrate or forcefully removed from Gaza into either Egypt or other countries in Europe and North America. This is the goal of Netanyahu openly. Washington Post reported in December of last year that Netanyahu had aggressively lobbied Sisi, United States, and France and UK into allowing them to push hundreds of, quote unquote, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians into Egypt. So as long as they have this sort of vague umbrella of eliminating Hamas, they can kind of kill as many people as they want, however long as they want. And also they can displace, they can let disease, now polio is taking grip in Gaza. Right. They can kind of let it run its course. They can kind of do the soft version of ethnic cleansing, although of course it's not soft, but it's not in the sense that they're achieving it as quickly as they initially wanted to. But ultimately the population is reducing. People are living in constant hell, obviously preventable disease, diabetes, dialysis, you name it. And they can kind of do that so long as they're doing this quote unquote ceasefire negotiations. Now, then the question becomes, are these good faith negotiations towards an actual sort of lasting settlement? But again, Israel's been very clear that is not what these negotiations are. These are negotiations for a 1 or 2 week pause, possibly as much as 6 weeks, and then they go back to what they're doing. And the U.S. is trying to paint it as actually a stepping stone to something that's long term, but Israeli officials consistently undermine that. After Biden gave his May 31st speech, where he actually for the first time began to use the language of quote unquote ending the war, there was a ray of hope. People said, okay, wait, is this the official kind of end here? Of course, people, again, familiar with how these things typically work, know that that happens in a private phone call. It doesn't happen in a speech. And it certainly isn't presented as an Israeli ceasefire proposal. They kept calling it an Israeli ceasefire proposal and saying Hamas has to accept it. Again, Israel immediately comes out and says that is not what our ceasefire proposal said. Our ceasefire proposal was a temporary pause with hostage exchanges, and we are going to go back to killing a bunch of Israelis. And so then you cut to this week, or last week, when Netanyahu visits Congress, gives his speech, and then Vice President Harris goes and says, oh, we're pushing towards, starts repeating the exact same bad faith talking points about, quote unquote, pushing for a ceasefire. Again, Biden doesn't have to push for a ceasefire. He can impose one whenever he wants. This has been the case for almost 10 months.
So, and I saw reporting, I think we talked about it yesterday, that administration officials are also quietly acknowledging that essentially the Israelis keep moving the goalposts whenever they're supposedly getting close to a ceasefire agreement.
But I want to be very clear here. I want to be very clear here. That is not really true from the part of the White House. That if you actually listen to what they're saying, they said we don't want a lasting ceasefire over and over again. The White House either chooses to hear what they want to hear, or is taking, again, this kind of vague framework and spinning it as something it's not.
I think Hamas has already agreed to the idea of a ceasefire that wouldn't involve a lasting peace. And even with that concession,
yes, that's true.
That's my point. Even with that concession, the Israelis don't even want to get to a temporary ceasefire at this point. And I think the fear is that if they did have a temporary ceasefire, that inertia will take over, which I think was also probably the hope of the Biden administration, which is not to say that that is in any way relieves them of the responsibility of being able to impose a ceasefire. But there is obviously an incredible reluctance to do that by the Biden administration. So in terms of Harris, in terms of divining Harris's position, how does one? What would it look like for her to do something that would be interpreted as different?
That's a good question. That's the question people are asking, and I think that when Representative Rashida Tlaib says things like, I'm withholding my endorsement from Harris until I hear her position on Gaza, and groups like Uncommitted, and of course a dozen Palestinian groups, there are ways in which Harris can back channel these groups in those with credibility, both in politics and activist organizations, and signal that she genuinely is going to do the normal playbook, which is use America's dispositive leverage over Israel to impose a ceasefire. There's ways that she can do that without openly contradicting her boss. And again, there's always these kind of process reasons. I wrote an article once called there's always a reason nothing can change and nothing you do matters. There's always these kind of like instant sort of Mick arguments for why the government's always either impotent or trying their hardest and fumbling the ball. There's always an excuse why no one can sort of oppose the fact of genocide in Gaza. And I think that there are plenty of ways in which Harris can work around those constraints to signal to these groups with credibility that she is actually serious about actually imposing a ceasefire. The one kicker card is, and when you talked about the Biden White House hoping inertia would set in for the temporary pause, there's been divisions within the U.S. government about this issue. And if one uses David Ignatius at the Washington Post as a kind of weather vane of where the CIA is, it's very clear the CIA has been over this war for months now.
Yeah.
And the CIA is pushing for a genuine ceasefire. That's why when they call in William Burns, he's having real talks. He's not doing the Anthony Blinken thing where he goes in and he scolds Hamas and makes up some bullshit about an Israeli ceasefire. It's a genuine talk. The CIA doesn't get invited to these things unless there's actual politics to be done. They're not really there for the veneer. So to the extent to which there's a ray of hope, Harris could endorse that, or could really move towards that, it would be coming from a different faction within the so-called deep state. And I think the Pentagon doesn't really care for this, doesn't really care about this. Because again, they spend all this time on their own self-mythologizing around freedom and democracy and human rights. And that's all gone to shit. That was always not very credible. But now the credibility of that has gone from 7%
right. The story about the rules-based international order, that's out the window
and they believe, and so in their mind, they're thinking, okay, Israel's made their point. The political consideration would be, if you did impose a unilateral ceasefire on Israel, would it be framed by the media as a Hamas victory? Probably, just sort of similar to like in Afghanistan. But yeah, so what? Is your short-term PR optics worth another 10,000, 20,000 dead Palestinian children? Probably not. So there are ways in which Harris can signal that there are groups and people for whom she can confide in. She has their numbers. She's one of the top 4 most powerful people in the world. She can call them whenever she wants. And the fact that she has yet to do so indicates to me that she's simply going to double down on a more sophisticated version of what the Biden White House has done, which is what I call a combination of fake ceasefire talks and highly sophisticated empathy speak. This kind of I see you, I hear you bullshit that matters to precisely Dick.
I don't want to be I don't mean to be Pollyannish about this, but if the choices as a political matter, right? Because we can agree that Harris right now, and I am certainly not defending Harris in this instance. I want to make this absolutely clear. But but the point is to analyze this from Harris's perspective. If we can agree that Harris has no real capacity to influence this decision at this juncture, it seems to me the best that could happen is that she indicates a seriousness about this that makes Netanyahu feel like, okay, if she wins in November, I've got a problem starting in January. That to me seems to be the only, is there a different way in which she could influence this? I'm saying not represent what her position would be, but I'm saying actually influence this. Because in that instance, if what I've just suggested is the case, it may not be, then anything that she does in terms of indicating to these groups, to back channels, whatever it is strictly electoral anyways.
Yeah, but no, the politicians are actually pretty honest about these things, especially in this context, because again, if that were the case, then she would have done that already. I think they, again, if she just wanted to get the uncommitted, lefties off her back, she would make these promises to these groups.
I mean, but I think there's probably a calculation. I don't know if it's right or wrong. I suspect that it's wrong, that her making a significant difference. I mean, in a shift from Biden, it comes with some political price as well. I mean, because
so what? I mean, there's always again.
I agree,
liberal apologists can always game out some meta discussion, electoral reason. We could do this all day, right?
I'm trying to make an assessment as to what she can do at this point. This is not a justification for her, but this is part of the analysis.
You're playing devil's advocate a little bit. I get that.
Yeah. But if her actual ability to materially change the situation is limited, except for the notion of Netanyahu feeling like if she wins the election, I'm in trouble. Then after that, it just becomes for her a political calculation as to what is the value of appeasing the lefties, as it were. I mean, I just for the sake of ease, or sort of like indicating a bigger shift from Biden's policy beyond the fact that she didn't go to his talk.
So the issue of whether or not, there was a CNN memo when they were basically running a parallel, or rather a memo leaked to CNN when they were running a parallel Harris campaign after the debate before he dropped out in early July. And one of the key points on that memo was highlighted how Harris didn't have the albatross of Gaza hanging around her neck, and that this was a major thing holding Biden back, and that Harris could break from that. So, internally, everybody knows this is unpopular. Again, people like to sometimes make these arguments about, well, what about the pro-Israel vote? Again, no one's asking, Kamala Harris to tell Israel to lay down its arms and surrender, right? They're asking them to stop killing dozens of children, a day. So I think that's a bit of a kind of a false dichotomy. There is tremendous upside to looking like you're good on this issue. It is tremendously popular. It is popular with over 50%, 70% of Democrats. Again, it depends how you phrase the question, but generally it would be very popular for people to wrap this thing up. The constant stream of dead kids on people's social media is dragging down the Democratic brand just on a purely psychopathic kind of Machiavellian political dimension here. It undermines youth support. So Harris knows this. That's one of the reasons. I think it's one of the reasons there was a real tipping point to move it to Harris versus Biden. I think this thing had really sunk Biden. Obviously, I'm somewhat self-interested in saying that, but I think other analysts have agreed with that at least in part, in addition to the obvious, the sort of deteriorating age issue, or cognitive decline, that this issue was absolutely destroying momentum. They had basically no volunteers.
I totally agree.
And that Harris was going to sort of be a superficial, at least pivot away from that. And I think people kind of got caught up in that. And there hasn't been really any kind of parallel substantive break from policy, which again is not to say that is not forthcoming or can't happen.
Right.
But to me, it's incumbent upon those for whom this issue is important, those for whom you would like to stop the gratuitous mass killing of children in Palestine with U.S. bombs, to demand clarity rather than vibes, to demand some kind of back channel commitment rather than more bleeding heart rhetoric about how, I see you, I feel you, claptrap. That there has to be something substantive to back up, because ultimately she's still running a campaign. She's still running for president, and effectively won a primary she never fought in. These issues were not allowed to be dealt with in a primary. We just skipped that, went straight to the coronation, and now it says, if you're going to be different, on certain issues, there needs to be some kind of signal or assurances behind, other than more sophisticated crocodile tears. And that is yet to be forthcoming.
I think the role of the demobilization and demoralization of activists and young people is completely underestimated in the pressure that was brought to Biden. I think the attempt by Sanders and the squad to sort of stay in Biden's camp was completely undermined by where he was on Gaza, and were it not for the Biden's policy, the outcome may have been different in some way. I'm not sure, but I do think that the problem that Harris is going to have is within the first week, the first couple of weeks, there's not that level of scrutiny by supporters, but she's going to have to address it over the course of the next 2 or 3 months.
Especially in light of recent escalations, which have pretty much cemented the fact that Israel is not negotiating anything in good faith. So when you execute your key counterpart in your negotiation with a Hellfire missile or whatever it was,
yep.
And then Harris says the next day, I support these ceasefire negotiations. This is not a credible or serious thing to say. And this is why, by the way, as the Biden White House began to co-opt this term ceasefire into this meaningless temporary pause hostage swap / sort of vibes-based rhetorical cup and ball game, activists switched their demand away from a ceasefire to an arms embargo for that reason. Because it's kind of like how Black Lives Matter got co-opted by Bank of America and sort of stopped meaning anything, and then people say, okay, well, defund the police, because that you can't really co-op, right? You can't have the wellsfargo.com defund the police seminar, right? It doesn't really work. And cutting off arms to Israel is by the way, was the implied mechanism with which one got a ceasefire.
Right.
But now they have to say it explicitly because they've done this rhetorical game. And I think assurances that, again, not that necessarily Harris will cut off arms to Israel, or that's sort of too whatever, but at least a threat of it, as Reagan did, as Bush did, as Biden did in 2021. This is always the implied threat. This is the whole point of having client states. And so I think that something towards that, even if it is kind of couched in this as a kind of CIA effort, or whatever, right? It's not like this, everyone in the, security state is gung ho for this. There are allies that,
you had Lloyd Austin coming out in December saying, you can win the battle, but lose the war with this type of thing.
They've been saying this stuff for months. Everybody knows it, right? And again, even Blinken behind closed doors says it. So it does appear to be a uniquely recalcitrant, racist, stubborn old Biden thing.
Well, that's the thing, is I think, this is where it gets difficult to define where Harris is, because from my perspective, Biden seems to be uniquely like sui generis in terms of his just utter disregard for Palestinian lives. This is a guy who supposedly, made Menachem Begin blush in the assault on Lebanon 40 some odd years ago. And so I think, like, just by virtue of that, there is a certain benefit of doubt that is given to Harris. But I do think that that benefit of doubt, it's not sustainable over the course of 12 weeks. Certainly, it's very problematic if she picks someone like Shapiro, it seems to me, where he is sort of very clearly associated with a similar perspective as Biden's in terms of his Zionism and his disdain for people who are protesting against this. But I guess we will, if she is to make those overtures to these groups, if that's the way that she would signal it, then we will have a better sense in the coming weeks. But we will link to your piece that's at Real News today. And I think it's going to be interesting to see if there is this benefit of doubt that is given to her, or if broadly the people who are definitely, I think, sort of turned off by Biden over this issue are going to sort of require some form of like receipts or something to that effect.
Unfortunately, branding matters. The more sophisticated empathy speak is, I think, it works. Again, I think the White House's effort to co-opt the concept of ceasefire and completely alter the meaning was incredibly successful. It got a lot of the heat off, in conjunction with colleges going on summer break and police crackdowns. But the heat really got off of them after that, because then they could sort of shift the burden and say, oh, well, we support a ceasefire negotiation. And of course, it was a totally different thing than what everyone was demanding.
Right.
So, these people are pretty sophisticated. They knew that Biden was going to go all in on this to the end, and they knew that this was a PR problem to manage. And by and large, they've actually, I think, done a pretty decent job of it since February.
Do you think Biden thought that it would go this long, though? My sense is that you think he did?
Yeah, I think he's a racist who thinks in sort of generic war on terror dynamics, and he thinks that they're basically equivalent to Nazis, and it's World War II, and if it lasts 5 years, it lasts 5 years. I don't see any reason to believe.
Do you think Harris has that same disposition?
I have no idea what Harris thinks. Harris has no pedigree of political or ideological commitments whatsoever to speak of. She shifts positions every few months. She was supporting single payer, then not supporting single payer. I don't even think Harris knows what Harris believes. and possibly that could work to one's advantage, right? If
Hopefully,
if she sees this as that's why it has to be
far
seen
be
as
it for me to have the CIA being influencing.
I mean, it's just the way it's the way the cookie crumbles, because this has gotten so egregious and so bad for the brand, and I think that, but again, none of this is possible without U.S. support, and it's important to make that clear. And I think that the extent to which there needs to be a pain point. There needs to be a feeling that she can't take this good energy for granted, and that she can't take these good vibes and social media vibes for granted, and that there is a genuine threat of people sitting on the couch, because that's the issue of Gaza is not a vote for Trump. It's a people staying home thing, and without a real sense of that threat, and this is where you get into some of the kind of game theory. Without a sense of a real threat, she has zero incentive to adjust her position, even if she is in office. And if everyone becomes a mindless lever puller, again, as genuinely fearful and as genuinely threatening as another Trump term would be, then there's no incentive, because there's no other mechanism to influence this at all. Because there was no primary, right? There was no way anyone could have chimed in on any of this, other than protesting into the void and being tear gassed and clubbed by cops and right wing vigilantes.
I mean, I think I am not 100% sure that there's no incentive in that instance once she becomes in office. Like, I don't know what Obama's incentive was, and he was much better, it seems to me, broadly speaking, on these
Well, I mean,
issues.
they killed 1,500 people in 2014. They killed 550 children, and that was in response to nothing. I mean, this was in response to over 1,100 Israelis and foreign nationals dying. That was in relation to nothing. So, again, there was always a sense of proportionality.
It was also a different era where you didn't have the record of Tim Kaine, boycotting Netanyahu's speech a couple of years later. I mean, it's a different environment as well. And,
it is.
again,
I think people are tired of I think they've gotten, I think
there's
incredibly greedy with this.
There's no
genocide.
rationality to the policy that we have now towards Israel, it seems to me. And the rationale is one, I think, of that's why I think it's sort of uniquely Biden-esque, because the politics have definitely changed. You didn't have 86 Democratic senators and congresspeople boycott Netanyahu last time.
Yeah, but it's important to understand that those boycotts take place within a very specific liberal Zionist milieu, and they are about the personality of Netanyahu versus the actual military objectives. I think it gets a little confusing. And I think some of them were, but I think a lot of them, if you actually read their statements, were like, I support Israel's right to defend itself, blah, blah, blah. But Netanyahu's gone too far, even though the quote unquote war is actually quite popular in Israel and remains popular in Israel. And the idea that Hamas cannot survive post ceasefire is actually the uniform consensus within the U.S. military establishment, the logical, or rather electoral establishment, the logical implication of which is that this goes on for years. So that's everybody wants
Israel,
to have their cake and eat it too.
I understand that. And I know that it's definitely easier for, U.S. politicians to make this about Netanyahu, but I think I think the hope there is that getting rid of Netanyahu or expressing it that way it's not going to impact the question of a one or a two state solution, and it's not going to address the question of Zionism more broadly, without a doubt. But I think first order thing is to stop the immiseration and the sort of rolling genocide, ethnic cleansing.
The problem is that even the so-called liberals or moderates in Israel still support this. That's the problem.
Well, I'm not talking about Israel. I'm talking about in the United States. I mean,
right.
That's where that's the leverage point.
Do I think there's been a vibe shift? Yes, and I think a lot of that has to do with the naked cruelty and cynicism of this current campaign. Totally. I definitely think there's a vibe shift, especially around this kind of romantic 1960s,
Exodus. Yes. I know. Yes.
All that stuff is kind of just gone now. And then you see they're not doing themselves any favor by allowing their IDF soldiers on Telegram and TikTok.
And we just saw them admitting after 7 months of reporting that there's been torture of Palestinian prisoners who have no business being there anyways. So, all right. Well, we'll link to your piece, and I guess over the course of the next I don't know, 6 weeks, 12 weeks, we'll have a better sense of like whether Harris will come to the call. I think if Shapiro, frankly, gets the pick, I think a lot of that conversation has already been resolved.
Probably.
But we'll see. Adam Johnson, the podcast is Citations Needed, and the newsletter is the column at Substack. We'll link to both those as well. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me on.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.